All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is our very first Hunger and Homelessness Awareness Week for 2020, and I am so pleased to be joined by Dr. Analena Hope Hassberg with her presentation on food justice and, excuse me, understanding food insecurity. Dr. Analena Hope Hassberg is a scholar, activist, educator, and mother committed to organizing low-income communities of color around food justice and environmental justice. Dr. Hope is an assistant professor of ethnic and women's studies at California State Polytechnic University, Pomona, a Ford Foundation predoctoral and dissertation fellow, and an active member of several social justice organizations throughout Los Angeles County and the San Francisco Bay Area. Her research investigates and complicates notions of food security and food sovereignty, and situates food as central to freedom struggles and contemporary liberation movements. So during our presentation, if you do have any questions, please send them directly to the Tuffy's Basic Needs account for our moderated Q&A at the end. This webinar is also being recorded and will be posted to our website. And additionally, please keep yourselves muted throughout the presentation. And like I said, we'll have an opportunity for a moderated Q&A at the end. So again, thank you for joining Tuffy's Basic Needs Services Center in our first Hunger and Homelessness Awareness event. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Hope. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Greetings, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here today. And thank you to the CSU Fullerton Basic Needs team for the invitation. So my work is all about food. When I say I work on food, people sometimes assume I'm a chef or a nutritionist, and I'm neither of those things officially, although I do make a mean gluten-free pancake, for the record. So I'm an ethnic studies scholar, which means that my work on food situates food as that which is at the root of our cultural identity, right? It's how we know ourselves and our kin and our place in the world. And my research also uses food as a lens to examine the relationship between race, place, space, class, and sustainable urban futures. So for the last 12 years, I have lived and worked in Los Angeles. There's Los Angeles. People who only know LA from the media might think of wealthy celebrities, or they might think of heavily policed Black and brown neighborhoods plagued by guns and drugs and violence. And while there's much more than that in between, LA does encompass both of these extremes of wealth and poverty, and in some ways more starkly than other American cities. Environmental historian Mike Davis says that Los Angeles has, quote, come to play the double role of utopia and dystopia for advanced capitalism. So utopia means a perfect world, right? And dystopia is its opposite. But the opposite of a perfect world isn't just an imperfect world, right? It's more severe and more extreme than that. So for those of us with money, LA can feel like a paradise. The weather is warm almost year round. We have the beaches and the mountains, and literally any experience or product that one could want is readily available for purchase. But for those of us without money, LA can produce much suffering, much injustice. So let's take a closer look at LA. The west side of the city is home to famously wealthy neighborhoods like Bel Air, Beverly Hills, and in addition to some of the most beautiful beaches and mountains in Southern California, West LA residents also enjoy clean parks, reliable buses, farmers markets, and grocery stores with healthy organic options. Demographically, this part of the city is also predominantly white. And this, by contrast, is South Los Angeles. Spatially, it is nowhere near the beach or the mountains. It's further inland, we can see, and it's dissected by freeways. And depending on where you draw your boundaries, South LA can also include Inglewood. It can go south of the 105 freeway, right? So these boundaries are a little bit flexible, but generally you can see that it's situated more inland. Racially, it's predominantly Latinx and Black, with hundreds of liquor stores, fast food as far as the eye can see, and only a handful of grocery stores where the fruits and vegetables seem to always be on the verge of spoiling. And so this here on the screen is the University Park neighborhood, where USC is located. So I was trained in part by geographers, so I love maps. This one, for example, visually displays the extreme income variance between West and South LA. So you can see the high concentration of wealth on the West side and the high concentration of poverty in South LA. And I'm sure many of you have also heard of the upwardly mobile Black neighborhood of Baldwin Hills, also known as the Black Beverly Hills, right? And so it's important to note that while income levels in Baldwin Hills are higher than other Black Los Angeles neighborhoods, they're still lower than the actual Beverly Hills, right, on the West side. Also, Baldwin Hills residents still have to shop for their food at the same grocery stores, right, or wherever they get their food in their neighborhood as their less wealthy neighborhoods, right? So because Baldwin Hills is still in South LA, the foodscape or the food landscape is the same. So unless they leave the neighborhood to shop, which many people do, they're kind of situated in the same, having the same experience with the foodscape. This map here shows diabetes rates in South LA with another map layer for grocery store locations. So we see that the areas with the highest rates of diabetes are also the areas with the fewest grocery stores and the lowest income levels. And this one compares it to the rest of Los Angeles County. So you can see the striking spatial and racial nature of diabetes when you compare the West Side with areas where Black and brown people are concentrated, right? Like South Central, East LA, right? So these maps are from 2013, so they're outdated now, right? But they do give us a way to visualize these disparities, the numbers that we're talking about. So I do mixed methodology work, quantitative and qualitative work, because I think the maps and numbers demonstrate the problem, they quantify the problem, while people's stories and narratives humanize the problem, right? And I especially love infographics, which do a little bit of both. This infographic here was created by Community Coalition, and it demonstrates that South LA is physically about half the size of West LA, but it has twice as many people. That means that the grocery stores in South LA, of which there are already fewer, are serving more people. And so when this infographic was made, there were almost 3 times as many farmers markets on the West Side than there were in South LA. So 72% of the restaurants in South LA were fast food, and there were 9 liquor stores per square mile in that region of the city, right? So as it says up here in the corner, healthy eating is not simply a matter of personal choice. Some communities have a bounty of healthy food options while others don't. Where you live can determine your health and your quality of life. And so it's really important to note here that people who live in West LA, by no means do they have a perfect food system, right? 41% fast food and 2 liquor stores per square mile are still really high numbers that indicate an imbalance in the food system that allows unhealthy substances to dominate even affluent areas. And so I think the key takeaway here is that it does take effort to eat healthy. And on the West Side, a person seeking a healthy lifestyle at least stands a fighting chance. So going back to this slide for just a moment, this is the foodscape or food landscape directly outside of USC's campus where I did my graduate study. And even though USC is a wealthy private university, it's situated right in the heart of a low-income community, right? This community that is by no coincidence also considered a food desert. So food desert basically means that it's an area where access to healthy food is limited, and there's an abundance of what they call fringe food. So fast food, gas station food, corner store food, and so forth. The term food desert is popular now in food circles. I'm sure many of you have heard it, but it's complicated because deserts like this one are naturally occurring as part of our planet's ecosystem, right? Food deserts, though, are very unnatural, and some would argue that they're deliberate. And those of us who study the natural world, we know that there's an abundance of life in the desert, but the word desert implies that there's scarcity. And when we think of people in a desert, we think of them as victims in need of saving. So when I use the term food desert, I follow the lead of epidemiologist George Kaplan, who points out that the word desert as a noun refers to a barren, desolate wasteland. It qualifies the place itself rather than the processes that have shaped it. But when we use desert as a verb, it means to abandon, to forsake, to cast aside. So using desertion as a verb in the context of the foodscape really illuminates the structural processes that have unevenly produced it. So redlining, predatory lending in the housing market, supermarkets that leave the inner city to relocate in the suburbs where there's more capital, right? So in other words, using desertion as a verb helps us to understand the how behind places like South LA, South Pomona, East Oakland, and so many others across the country. And I think if we really want to understand and address issues of hunger and homelessness and the underlying central issue of poverty, right, we have to be clear that there are entities that are creating food insecurity, creating housing insecurity, and other social problems by deserting people who are in need of their services. So when I moved to LA in 2009, the corporate food system was really starting to be exposed through documentary films and popular books for the first time. You all have likely seen one or more of these films that describe in horrifying detail the harmful impacts of the food system on our bodies and on workers and animals and on the environment, right? And you probably noticed that most of these films or books also offer some solutions for those of us who are horrified enough to start making some personal changes. The prescription in most cases is that everyone who eats should vote with our forks, right? We should opt out of the corporate food system and opt into an alternative food movement where we only buy local, organic food, or even better, we should all grow our own food, right? And divest completely from the corporate food system. So this sounds great. I love this idea. I wish I could participate, right? But there's this glaring omission that alternative food movements, although they want a more just and equitable food system, they have historically failed to critically engage the role of race and class in people's food choices and their subsequent health outcomes. The alternative food movements that prescribe voting with your fork and opting out of corporate food assume that we can all participate in those actions. And if we don't participate, it assumes that we must not care about our health or the health of the planet. So the alternative food movement kind of takes for granted that all of these solutions require time and money and land, right? All these things that poor people and poor people of color in particular generally have very little of, right? So even the alternatives can be inaccessible because organic food is expensive, right? You all know that, having visited a grocery store in recent days and weeks and months, right? And in food desert neighborhoods, eating local can be a death sentence when the foodscape is fast food, junk food, alcohol, right? Anyone who's ever tried gardening knows that it is hard to grow food. It is hard work, right? Especially when you don't own your own land or control your own time. Another thing that's impacting our foodscape is gentrification. So I'm sure you all have heard this term. Gentrification is the process by which wealthier people move in to historically low-income neighborhoods, urban neighborhoods. And gentrification, although it does improve housing and attract new businesses to the area, it also frequently displaces current inhabitants, right? And it changes the character of the neighborhood. So I'm from San Francisco originally, and when I go home, right, I can't even consider it home anymore. It's unrecognizable. I don't know who any of these people are, any of these businesses are, right? And cities, they change over time, naturally, but gentrification speeds this process up to the point where folks have to, head for the hills, literally. So the reason you may have heard gentrification discussed in a negative or a critical way is because it makes these poor neighborhoods more livable for outsiders, but it pushes out people who have been there for generations. So what is the significance of this work to the CSU, Cal State University student body? Across our 23 campuses, we have more than 474,000 students. 21%, or 1 in 5, are food insecure, right? Which means that they don't know where their next meal will come from. 8%, or 1 in 12, are housing displaced, which means they don't have a reliable place to live. So the CSU system serves, working class students. We're public state universities. We serve students who are commuting most of the time from gentrifying food desert neighborhoods like the ones that I'm describing, right? A lot of our students are coming from South LA, right? Going all the way to Pomona to study and get their education. And so the conversations that we're having about food insecurity and housing insecurity within our CSU system would really benefit from this larger structural analysis of the food system and its connection to other social justice issues like housing insecurity, gentrification, poverty, unemployment, transportation access, right, and much more. So I want to talk a little bit about the larger theoretical frameworks and ideas that help me understand these social issues and the ways that they're connected. So a major theory that grounds my own work is environmental justice. So environmental justice is different from environmentalism, which is the idea that we need to protect and defend the natural environment, like rivers, lakes, mountains, right? The natural environment as we understand it. Environmentalism emerged in the late 19th century in response to the Industrial Revolution and the toll that new technologies and industries were taking on the planet. So environmental justice is different in a few distinct ways. So first, it redefines the definition of the environment, right? Not just the natural world, but also those places where we live, work, play, learn, and worship, in addition to the physical natural world. So this definition here comes from Robert Bullard, who is also known as the father of environmental justice for his important work. So expanding what we think of as the environment allowed for these new conversations about inner city spaces that are occupied and populated by people of color, and these kind of people and places that traditional environmentalism did not initially address. Environmental justice is very much about exploring proximity to hazards and distance from goods, right? So it could be hazards like what you see in the background here, like an incinerator or a refinery, and proximity to goods like green space, parks, right? Places where you can go and safely play or take your family. And it also deals with the racialized nature of where and how these hazards are located. So anyone who's ever driven down the 110 towards San Pedro, right, you pass Carson, you pass all of these refineries. And again, these are predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods, right? And so there's something, this environmental justice literature has really found that there's a deliberate citing of environmental hazards in communities of color. That's not just here in the US, that's on a global level. Where we dump our toxins and our chemicals is usually in communities that are lacking political and social capital to stand up for themselves. So understanding environmental justice is really critical to understanding food justice because it's a precursor to food justice, right? It came first. And also in places like South LA, residents are disproportionately exposed to food-related hazards like liquor stores, fast food restaurants, right? And they have limited access to food-related goods like fresh fruits, organic vegetables, nutrition education, right? So what is food justice? Food justice is the idea that all people have a right to nutritious, culturally appropriate food, regardless of race or income or where they live. So food justice is about more than just access to food though, and this is important. So the definition that I resonate most deeply with comes from the Just Food organization in New York City, which says food justice is communities exercising their right to grow, sell, and eat healthy food. Healthy food is fresh, nutritious, affordable, culturally appropriate, and grown locally with care for the well-being of the land, workers, and animals. People practicing food justice leads to a strong local food system, self-reliant communities, and a healthy environment. So there are lots of different ways to articulate what food justice is. This is not the only definition, but I like this definition because it differentiates food justice from food security, right? Which is simply having enough food at all times for a healthy lifestyle. So that's very vague. This definition describes what healthy food is. It addresses self-determination, cultural competency, right? And the need for strong local food systems. So again, when we're talking about food insecurity and we think, well, what's the opposite of food insecurity? We automatically say food security. But by definition, food security is vague enough that having access to food could mean that you have, a Burger King in your neighborhood, right? It does not account for or deliberately set standards for what healthy access looks like. So like environmental justice, food justice is also about centering communities that are marginalized generally, right? Communities of color, low-income urban areas that don't have the same chances as other neighborhoods to eat healthy and be well. So there's another related concept that I want to bring in, and some of you may be familiar with it, food sovereignty. So food sovereignty is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods. It puts the aspirations and needs of those who produce, distribute, and consume food, so us, the people, at the heart of food systems and policies, rather than the demands of markets and corporations. So this definition comes from La Via Campesina, which is a peasant rights organization, global peasant rights organization. And so this definition sounds very similar to the definition of food justice that I shared earlier, right? The difference is conversations about food sovereignty are generally applied to rural countries outside of the US. But my research suggests that revolutionary food systems are possible in urban spaces like South LA, where low-income residents rarely own the land that they live, work, and play on. So now I would like to share a few examples of food justice in action in a historical and a contemporary context. I'm sure some of you recognize these folks, right? They're members of the Black Panther Party for self-defense, as it was known at the time. This image of them holding guns at the state capitol in Sacramento is generally how the Panthers are remembered and how they're imagined, right? They're remembered as these radical armed militants. But what a lot of people don't know is that the Black Panthers were early food justice practitioners, right? Who used food to really help Black and oppressed communities become healthier and more self-sufficient. These are a few of the social service programs that the Black Panther Party created. You can see, I won't read them all, but you can see that they had a range of programs designed to support the community. They had free food, they had free legal services, cooperative housing, they even had community schools and free ambulances, right? Because we all know how long it takes an ambulance to come in the inner city. So the Panthers created these programs in response to the ways that the Black community was, again, abandoned and deserted by industry and government and policymakers, right? And I think these programs are still incredibly relevant to this moment and would be really useful today. So I take this as a model for not just a historical example, but a future template for where we want to go. So those of you who have studied the Panther Party, you know that the formal structure of the party started disintegrating in the 1970s for a number of reasons, right? And there was lots of concern about how to preserve the survival programs because these had become the heart of the Black Panther Party's work. So in South LA, the Southern California chapter of the Panther Party founded a nonprofit so that they could sustain their Serve the People programs for the foreseeable future. So this nonprofit is called Community Services Unlimited, and their acronym, like ours, is also CSU. So CSU has become one of South LA's foremost food justice organizations, and they work to create equitable and healthful communities. And I'm fortunate enough to have served as the board chair for CSU since 2012, and I started working with them in 2010 when I was doing my dissertation work at USC. And so before the pandemic, my food justice service learning students would go to CSU and support the work that they're doing every semester. We have 2 mini urban farms in South LA. One is at Normandy Elementary School, and one is in the Expo Center near USC, where the big Olympic pool is and where the Rams were playing for a while. We offer produce bag subscriptions where you can get a big bag of fresh local produce every week. We also host gardening and nutrition workshops. These are all virtual right now, but they're still happening. We offer youth internships, catering, and just last year we opened the Paul Robeson Community Wellness Center, which is the first organic wellness hub in South LA. So it's a 5,000 square foot building. It's LEED certified, which means it's designed to conserve energy and water and improve indoor air quality. The top floor of the building is CSU office headquarters, and there are additional rooms that we rent out for workshops and special events. The bottom floor includes the Village Marketplace, which is an organic market and cafe with a commercial kitchen that allows us to continue to meet the urgent healthy food demands of the community. So in addition, though, to improving the local foodscape, the Paul Robeson Center also sustains more than 4 decades of activism and organizing and cultural expression in South Los Angeles by hosting film screenings, book clubs, art exhibits, and even yoga and capoeira classes. Of course, again, all of this is pre-pandemic, but since the pandemic, community interest and engagement with our Village Marketplace has increased significantly, because remember, at the beginning of the pandemic and throughout, one of the most important things that was on everyone's mind was, where are we going to get food, right? The lines were around the corner, grocery store shelves were bare, and so the Village Marketplace was able to sustain the community foodscape by continuing to offer healthy food through delivery and curbside pickup throughout the entire pandemic. And I will put a link in the chat for the website. If anyone lives in LA or wants to support, you can shop online and then go pick up or have your order delivered. So I'll make sure to put that in the chat in a few. So the Wellness Center is also home to a new multimedia archive called the Sankofa Project, right? Which documents the Black Panther Party survival programs in LA and the radical principles that help to shape the local food and health justice scene. So Sankofa is a Ghanaian word that means to reach back and get it, or learning from the past to build toward the future. And one of our goals as an organization is to demonstrate that food justice work is not new, right? We didn't just come up with this in 2010, right? It follows in a long tradition of grassroots resilience and creativity. And the Black Panthers and their food programs, specifically their Breakfast for School Children program, really used food to address poverty and build community. And they may not have used the phrase food justice, but they paved the way for us to create new food systems that might otherwise have been impossible. Another historical instance of food justice and urban food sovereignty that I want to mention is the 14-acre South Central Farm, which I consider to be a utopia within the dystopia of South LA. You all may be familiar with the story of the South Central Farm. The land was allocated to become an urban farm project after the 1992 civil unrest and uprisings here in LA. And a collective of about 350 families, mostly from Mexico and Central and South America, transformed this once empty lot into a lush paradise with over 150 different edible and medicinal plant species. So the South Central farmers were practicing food sovereignty in the city for almost 15 years. They cultivated this sense of place and community using traditions and heirloom seeds from their countries of origin, right? They brought all of that with them. And they filled a need in the community that was not being met by the state or private industry. So sadly, the farm was bulldozed back to dust in 2006. Very tragic, after the land was reclaimed by the original owner, who had wanted to build an incinerator there. And he thought the farm was this waste of space, right? So the destruction of the South Central Farm tells us that projects like this are very vulnerable, especially when we get into issues of ownership. Who owns the land? Who can come in and tell you you have to leave, right? But the fact that the farm existed at all, to me, demonstrates that it's possible to use urban space in this way. This is a possibility, right? Again, learning from the past to build toward the future. And we can use urban space in service of the health and well-being of the community. This quote here comes from Alberto Tlatoa, who grew up on the South Central Farm, and he's still active in the fight to get the land back because the South Central farmers are now farming up in Buttonwillow, California, which is near Bakersfield, but they're still working to get this space back because it's still vacant. It's still just sitting there, right? So Alberto says, we need to start reclaiming our concrete because most of our neighborhoods are concrete. The people making decisions for our communities are often outsiders who don't understand us culturally or our eating habits. I think they underestimate the power in South Central and the knowledge that exists in our roots as well. So it's empowering to remember that the soil is always still down there, right? Just below the concrete with all of its same potential for abundance. So it's important to note that food justice doesn't only happen within the context of nonprofits or large farming collectives with acres of land, right? Everyday people are doing this work too. So for instance, LA Green Grounds is a local grassroots organization that helps South LA residents to plant edible gardens in their homes. So some of you may be familiar with this group through Ron Finley, the self-proclaimed gangster gardener, right? He planted a garden in the parkway space between the sidewalk and the street outside of his home. So city-owned space. This is Ron Finley, and that's his garden. And some of you may have seen his TED Talk where he describes his experience, right? But basically, he planted a garden in the dirt on the sidewalk to bring fresh, free vegetables to the neighborhood. The city ordered him to remove the garden, right? And LA Green Grounds gathered all this public support through petitions and LA Times articles. And in 2013, the city council voted to allow LA residents to plant parkway gardens in the city without expensive permits, right? So this was a huge food justice win for the city of LA, for all of us, right? If you don't have a yard, but you have a little dirt out there in front of the house next to the street, you can plant there. And there's all these conversations to be had about soil quality and building raised bed gardens, right? So that's another conversation, but it is no longer illegal to use that space. So exercising our right to healthy food is really challenging in the city. It's challenging in the rural countryside as well, but I realized early in my own life that poverty makes it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to divest from corporate food systems. Right? Often the best that we can do is supplement with healthy food whenever possible. So in the city, sometimes we're only working with a backyard garden or a few square feet of dirt between the sidewalk and the street, like Ron Finley, because most city land is private property and it's unavailable to the public. And because so many of us have not been able to achieve home ownership, there's a constant risk of losing the land, as was the case for the South Central Farm. California also experiences frequent water shortages, and even small-scale farming uses a lot of water. So traditional plants in the ground agriculture is still a critical part of sustainable future food systems, but in order to offset these increasingly unpredictable futures that we're facing, we need to employ creative ways to start reducing waste and maximizing space. So I want to finish up with a brief discussion of some of the really cool cutting edge design technologies that can potentially reshape urban communities and help to address these issues of land and water scarcity. So many of you might be familiar with aquaponics, which is a process that connects aquaculture systems, meaning fish tanks in most cases, with hydroponic systems, so plants growing in water. And the fish waste filters down and fertilizes the soil, and it keeps it nutrient rich, and the soil filters the fish water, keeping it clean. So this is a self-sufficient closed loop system. And aquaponics can sustain a variety of crops with a fraction of the physical space and water that traditional farming requires, right? With almost no byproducts. And plants can grow at the same rate or even faster than plants in the ground, and they can be cultivated year-round, indoor, outdoor. Small aquaponics units are relatively simple to build and they're affordable to maintain. This is the aquaponics unit at Community Services Unlimited. It was built by students from USC in just 3 days over their spring break a few years ago, and it's still operational. These units are also easy to transport in the event of an eviction or a relocation, right? So aquaponics is also scalable, meaning it can be a single tank unit like this one, or it can be as large as a 10,000 square foot warehouse. So I did some research in Milwaukee a few years ago, and there was an organization called Sweetwater Organics, which had built a massive aquaponics system in an abandoned industrial building. And they were producing up to 150 pounds of vegetables a week and sourcing them to local businesses, restaurants, residents, right? Excuse me, cities like LA, when you think about the landscape in LA, it's scattered with empty warehouses, these reminders of an industrial era that is long gone now. And so what if these became indoor urban agriculture projects that grew and distributed plant-based food? Aside from the obvious health benefits, this could also be an economic boost for neighborhoods like Watts and South Central, still impacted by housing market discrimination, predatory lending, and the flight of capital to the suburbs. So to conclude, food is the lens that I use to understand the world as it is, as it was, and as it might someday be, right? My research, my teaching, my activism, they're all grounded in this deep commitment to social justice and really a desire to actualize these livable futures where the most oppressed among us are at the center. So I hope that all of you are similarly inspired to use food as a lens to examine the potential that exists in this present moment and to envision abundant, equitable, and non-dystopic futures for all of us. So I'd love to move now to some dialogue and hear any questions or comments you all may have. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hope, for providing your expertise on this really critical topic, particularly explaining the differences between food justice and food insecurity. I know I really am inspired to kind of think about how we might all promote food justice within our communities. We do have a couple questions that have come through, but again, as a reminder, if you do have any questions you'd like to ask, please submit them through the chat to the Tuffy's Basic Needs host, and we'll definitely include them. But one of the first questions we have is, do you have any suggestions on how individuals can have a conversation on food injustice issues with maybe peers or others in their communities who might not see it as an issue at all?
Yeah, I think for me, teaching about food justice within an ethnic studies framework has been really useful in helping folks to understand disparities that they might not have seen, right? I feel like looking at the foodscape is probably one of the easiest ways to see that there are these discrepancies. So for example, if you're just driving through LA or Pomona or Pasadena or any city, right? You know pretty clearly once you have entered an affluent area or entered a disadvantaged area. And one of the primary ways that you know that is by the foodscape. Now you're seeing more fast food. You might be seeing more people experiencing homelessness. You might be seeing just a different demographic of people. Now you're seeing Black and brown people where you were seeing white folks before, right? And so I think just getting people to kind of tune in to like what they themselves are already noticing, giving people language for what's happening in their neighborhoods. We feel gentrification very acutely, but we might not know this like super multi-syllabic word to describe it. So I think having these conversations is compared to other like racial justice issues that you might want to talk about, like police brutality, prison abolition, right? Talking about food feels pretty tame. Talking about where does our food come from? How hard is it to produce food? Who are the people who produce our food, right? Farm workers produce the majority of food grown here in California and across the country, right? And so having these conversations and then kind of entering into, well, how are these food systems racialized, right? It feels, it might feel daunting, but I think it's actually a great place to go and to start because everyone eats, right? Food is this like great equalizer, and it shows that we're not as different as we might think we are. Everybody has the same basic needs, right? We all need food and shelter and clean air and water, and right. And so that list is not exclusive to one race of people or gender of people, right, or class of people. But when we look at who actually gets access to those things, it's very racialized, it's very class based, right? So I think just kind of like giving another level of nuance to say like, oh, well, what do you notice about your food system? I love doing this with my students. Draw me a map of your foodscape. What does it look like? Okay, well, where is it that you live? What do the people look like? What are their income levels? And they start putting the pieces together on their own.
Thank you. I think the next couple of questions we've got kind of ties in line with what you've talked about, but two questions that are pretty similar are, what are some individual actionable steps that someone could take to promote food justice? And to go along with that, what are some ways that they could get involved with their community to make a difference? So I know you've brought up some great community organizations that potentially students or people in the community can get involved with, but how could they make a difference on their own individual side?
Well, I think food justice, like any other form of social justice, is very much a collective, community-based effort, right? I don't think there is a like, here's what I as an individual am going to do to achieve justice, right? It's about who am I building with? And so I think the second part of your question around getting involved with community organizations would be the answer for me. Like, who is doing this work already? You don't have to recreate the wheel here. If you want to plant a garden in your yard or, you know, pots on your porch, then yes, by all means do that, right? And I think there are all of these different groups that are approaching it different ways. So my students know I love to say there are many doors to the House of Food Justice, right? You can enter through policy. Maybe you want to improve policies that make the foodscape more equitable. Maybe you want to do the grassroots work of actual community organizing, right? Community growing. Maybe you want to do the nutrition education piece, right? I think it really is about what resonates with each of us about how food is demonstrating inequality and how it can lead to more equality and justice. But I always say, get involved with organizations who are already doing this work, because there's a lot of them and they're getting to be more linked, right? They're not in their silos as much as they were. They have relationships with each other. And so I think if you can create relationships with groups that are doing this work, just ordering your food from CSU. And I did tell you all I was going to put that link in the chat, so I need to do that. But just creating, you know, new pathways toward how you spend your money, because we can vote with our forks, right? That's just not the only way to do this work. And you have to have access. So before CSU existed, CSU Community Services Unlimited, CSU existed, selling healthy food in South LA, you would have to go 8 to 15 miles to get to a Whole Foods, right? And then you spend your whole paycheck at Whole Foods, right? And so that's actually not creating sustainable local change in your environment. So support what exists in your environment is what I would say. I'm going to stop sharing so I can get this link for everyone, but I would love to move on to the next question, or even comments, even things that other folks are doing. I know we have other experts on the call today that could speak to some of this.
We had several additional questions come in, but another question we have is about environmental hazard locations. And so the question is the environmental hazard location deliberate or a consequence of policy or zoning? And this person is trying to understand if zoning existed for each placement prior to people who were living in these places.
That's a great, great question. And I would say that there are these ongoing debates. I just put the link in the chat. Ongoing debates, the chicken or the egg, right? What came first? Was it the Black and brown people in the neighborhood, or was it the environmental hazard in the neighborhood? And it varies. It depends on the neighborhood that we're talking about, right? But I will say that what is deliberate is that environmentally hazardous polluters, right? They follow what's known as the path of least resistance, the path of least resistance. So if I want to build an incinerator, I'm gonna experience a lot of resistance in Beverly Hills, right? People have a lot of political power, cultural capital. They're gonna say, we don't want that, not in my backyard, right? NIMBY, not in my backyard. That's this whole environmental justice, you know, slogan and understanding that people don't want that in their neighborhoods, right? Put it somewhere else. And so that somewhere else is generally places where folks don't have the same kind of cultural capital. They don't have the same kind of political power to say, we don't want that here, right? Poor people don't want that in our neighborhoods, but we have 3 jobs and we might be undocumented, or we might have multiple children that we're caring for, right? And so there is not the same kind of, we don't have the same kind of time to go to the town hall meeting and talk to our senators and talk to our council people, right? And so there is a deliberate mechanism by which polluters seek out the path of least resistance, and that's generally by citing in oppressed communities. But you know, I really want to point out that this idea of like, just because it's not in your backyard, you know, your immediate backyard, the planet is not big. We can get around the whole globe in 24 hours, right? So whatever's happening, you know, when the Fukushima plant is leaking nuclear waste into the Pacific Ocean, that's our ocean. I take my daughter to the beach, that is the Pacific Ocean, right? And so there is no distinction really between where these things are happening and who they're impacting and how they're ultimately going to affect everyone. Some of us are on the front lines, but we're all, you know, inhabitants of this same planet. So that's a fantastic question. And the short answer is, it depends, right? Sometimes the Black and brown neighborhood is there first. Sometimes the incinerator is there first, because we, as people who have been historically pushed out of home ownership, will need to buy property or rent property in places that are affordable. And usually the lower rates are in places that are already polluted and already toxic, right? So it's very dependent on the actual neighborhood, but the correlation is pretty much consistent.
Thank you. This question's a little bit closer to home. It's about our CSU campuses, but the next question is, what further progress do you think needs to be done on our campuses, whether that's Fullerton, Pomona, et cetera, to support our impacted students?
Great question. I mean, I would have had a very different answer for you in February, right? And now that we're in this kind of weird virtual netherland, you know, it's hard to say, because I will say that pre-pandemic, I was working with a lot of different people across our campus, from, I'm in ethnic studies, to, you know, agriculture, biology, nutrition science. We were all working to try to get an actual physical green space on our campus. Now we're lucky because we have the Lyle Center for Regenerative Studies. They do amazing permaculture, aquaponics work up there, but they're kind of satellite located, right? You kind of have to cross a street and take a shuttle to get there, right? We were trying to build actual garden beds in the heart of campus. Now, moving forward, given that we are in this remote space, we don't know how long that will take. I think the way to work is, you know, just like this, right? I'm at Cal Poly Pomona, but this is, you know, a Fullerton-based basic needs Hunger and Homelessness Awareness Week event. And so I think creating these partnerships across campuses, I'm working with some colleagues right now on, you know, getting funding to do these CSU-wide urban agriculture projects, right? So we are using whatever creative, you know, resources that we have to think about what sustainability and food justice and, you know, housing justice, what these things look like in the context of the coronavirus pandemic. And it's challenging, to say the least, but we are operating with the assumption that we will eventually be back, and that we will build those gardens, and they will be teaching spaces for service learning classes like the one that I teach, or folks who are doing, you know, labs in nutrition science. And however, there's so many ways to learn from food and work with food. So in ethnic studies, we are invested in there being, you know, medicinal and herbal gardens that are clear about the indigenous roots and the lineage of the plants that we're working with, right? A nutrition scientist might be interested in something very different, but the same garden can hold space for all of that.
Thank you. I think the last question that we have time for is a lofty one. It's about destigmatization around food assistance. And I know you shared that the Black Panther Party was a grassroots organization that started a lot of survival programs, and food assistance was one of them. But do you have any thoughts on what are some ways to destigmatize food assistance, particularly, I guess, in light of the pandemic and what's been going on?
I think the pandemic itself kind of functions to destigmatize our relationships to food, because I think we a lot of us very acutely felt this like panic around food, right? Like early in the pandemic and throughout, like I said, the food system was one of the things that was like a harbinger for like all of the failures of capitalism, if I may, right? That we don't know where our next meal will come from if we can't get to the grocery store. And so I think programs like the one that Community Services Unlimited has created, where you can place an order and get a delivery or go do a pickup at a local, community-based food retailer, have gotten so much support because people are realizing that, oh, if I'm depending on Vons or if I'm depending on Walmart, right, that all they have to do is what they have historically done is leave the community, and then I have no options, right? So I think people are learning to grow their own food. I think there's almost a new kind of cool around, growing your own food and supporting local businesses, right? But I think poverty, unfortunately, also comes with a lot of shame, right? And so I think a lot of food justice groups that are doing this work, and I've talked to a lot of my students about this, how do we do this work without patronizing people, without coming in and telling them that they are doing it wrong and all they need to do is eat some kale and eat less tortillas and then they'll be fine, right? But because there's healthy food in every culture, and it's disrespectful, quite frankly, to come and tell people, how they're eating is wrong. But how can we go in and listen and hear people talk about what they want to see differently in their communities, right? Because I do think that as much as I support the food bank model and the food distribution model, that it's inherently unsustainable, right? It does not get at the root of the problem causing food insecurity. Giving away some free food to people who don't have access to food is what I call a Band-Aid solution, right? It's an immediate emergency solution and it's absolutely critical. But how are we building toward a place where people no longer need to keep coming to the food bank because they have a garden or they have the financial means to purchase food for their families, right? And so, for me, I think it's really about bigger picture thinking, and the destigmatizing piece, I think, comes in when you realize that, the Panthers did a lot of this too, right? They would have people who are like too ashamed to come and eat, but you look around and all your friends are there or your classmates are there, right? Your community is there and there is no shame around it. It is people breaking bread together in community, which is so central to human life.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hope. I know for me, this has sparked a lot of critical thinking. I truly appreciated your definition of food justice, and the key component for me was culturally appropriate. That's something I've not heard in the conversation before. So I'm definitely leaving today with a lot to mull over and to consider, and how could we move forward, to your point of making this sustainable and truly food justice, and not a Band-Aid solution, given the pandemic's highlighted, I think, some of the disparities across our culture. But thank you so much for your presentation. Again, I'm Victoria Jamie, and I'm the Basic Needs Center Coordinator for Tuffy's Basic Needs Services Center, and this was our first Hunger and Homelessness Awareness event. I do hope that you'll join us for the remainder of the week. Our programming calendar is available on our website. This webinar was recorded and will be posted to our website, and I'll be sure to include in the description the link that Dr. Hope provided. But thank you again for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.